So let's turn then to the book of Revelation, as has been made known to you by email. We're going to meditate on the three doors that are mentioned in this book of Revelation. The very concept of a door suggests something that has been beyond us until now, and now we're getting to see into it, which reminds us of God's promise in Jeremiah 33:3, call on me, and I will answer you and show you great and mighty or hidden or mysterious things that you don't know. And all of these three doors in Revelation are near the beginning of the book. They're all in chapters 3 and 4. It's as though God were offering to believers a peek into his ways before telling them of the future judgments to come. And these peaks are to give them some encouragement in what they see God offering from heaven. The first two of these doors are found on earth, and they have to do with the church age. But the third one is a sort of a preview of heaven and what God has ordered from heaven, what's going to come. And all three of them are addressed to faithful believers who were surrounded with circumstances that would tend to be discouraging for them. And the situation that we have in our day has a lot in common with that situation of the time when the revelation was given. We have many professing Christians who are a lot more preoccupied with the concerns of this world than of the world to come. And we often hear the gospel watered down in the way it's presented today. We are aware of mega churches that attract large crowds by means of entertainment. We hear a lot of perversions of the gospel, like the prosperity gospel, instead of calling on Christians to live sacrificially and to suffer for Christ. And society's attitude is very hostile toward true Christianity. Our governments are making wicked laws that show rebellion against biblical values. And Christians are just not making much impact on society, even though we're not called to change the world. Yet a strong Christian testimony ought to have some effect as the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But these three doors here are presented to show some encouragement. We would call it doors of divine encouragement. And the first one we're going to look at then, right now, will be the door of opportunity in service, which we find in chapter 3 of Revelation and verse 7. Then in our following session, we'll look at the door to fellowship for the faithful, which immediately follows. Then next Thursday, if the Lord hasn't come before then, we'll look at the door of our heavenly hope. So let's turn then to chapter 7 of Revelation and verse 7, and we'll meditate on the door of opportunity in service, Revelation 3 and verse 7. We read, "To the messenger of the assembly in Philadelphia, write, he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one can shut, and who shuts and no one opens, says these things. I know your works, that you have a little power, and kept my word, and didn't deny my name. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one can shut." So there's that word door, reference to the first door. Verse 9, "Behold, I am giving of the synagogue of Satan, of those who say they are Jews, and they are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them to come and do homage before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. Because you keep my command to endure, I also will keep you from the hour of testing, which is to come on the whole world, to test those who live on the earth. I am coming quickly. Hold firmly what you have, so that no one takes your crown. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will go out from there no more. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God, and my own new name. He who has an ear, let him listen to what the Spirit says to the assemblies. So this passage then tells about the door that we could call the door of opportunity and service, that open door that God said he had set before these believers and that nobody could shut it. And faithful service, whether as individuals or on the part of an assembly collectively, faithful service doesn't guarantee an outward appearance of success, whether in terms of numbers or an impression that we make in any other manner. We have to face satanic opposition, and we must expect a battle. So we're not guaranteed an outward appearance of success. There are some who labor on harder ground than others. The parable of the sower shows that different kinds of ground brought different kinds of yield. And both the parable of the talents and the parable of the pounds show us that the reward to the faithful servants was given not for successful service, but for faithful service. And in fact, faithfulness can sometimes cost us an appearance of failure, because faithfulness makes a laborer unpopular, so it can produce an appearance of failure. But we must not compare ourselves with others or compare the work that we're engaged in with some different work, because to do so, in fact, could produce pride on the part of those who have great apparent success, and it could produce discouragement for those who appear to have failed. But it's God's approval that we need to seek. Of the 7 assemblies that God sent letters to through John, this is the only one, this assembly in Philadelphia is the only one of which he says anything at all about the size of the assembly. He says, you have a little power, which seems to mean it was a small, struggling assembly. And I found no translations at all, and almost no commentaries which indicate that the expression a little power or a little strength was intended as a reproach. No translations that would lead to think that, and almost no commentaries. This expression, a little strength or a little power, rather indicates that Christ was speaking words of comfort to a small and struggling assembly. And Christ was encouraging this small and struggling assembly by telling it of this door of opportunity that he was setting before it. So Christ's door of opportunity then encourages a struggling assembly by showing it divine appreciation. We find that in verses 7 and 8. The idea of an open door to serve God clearly means an opportunity, because that expression is used 3 times in epistles in that sense of an open door that the Lord had set before somebody. And the very fact of Christ setting an open door before this assembly shows his confidence that the assembly would make use of it. Just as in the parable of the pounds, remember that after the master dealt with all 3 of his servants, he said to take the 1 pound away from the one to whom he had given only 1 pound and who had done nothing with it. And he said, give it to the man who has 10 pounds, implying he knows how to use it, so give it to him. And likewise, the Lord's giving this assembly in Philadelphia an opportunity of an open door, implied that he had confidence that this assembly knew how to use it. He makes an allusion here to Eliakim, who was a servant of the king, mentioned in Isaiah chapter 22, a servant of Hezekiah. And the Lord said to Eliakim that he had sent an open door before him. And he said he'd opened that door with the key of David, which indicated his authority to open it. So once God had opened a door by his authority, nobody could shut it. And he commends the assembly in Philadelphia for keeping the word of Christ, that is, staying true to the scriptures, and of not denying his name, even though they were under pressure to renounce their faith in him, which reminds us of Christ's words, Everyone who confesses me before men, him will I also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him will I also deny before my Father who is in heaven. So these were proofs then of the faithfulness that cost something. And Christ expressed appreciation for their paying the price of faithfulness in spite of their lack of strength or lack of power. This lack of strength or of power that he refers to, it could be that there were a small number. As a matter of fact, or it could mean that they were in a location where it was harder to build a work, maybe an area that was thinly populated, or where people were hardened to the gospel, or a place that tended to get depopulated. People were always moving away from there. And we've probably all known of areas that could be said of. In fact, we know that that was true of Philadelphia. It was an area of very frequent earthquakes and an ever-present threat of volcanic eruptions. So people were constantly thinking we'd be safer somewhere else, and they were moving away. And it was hard to establish a work in a place like that. So that would be one explanation for their small number and their little power or little strength. But they persevered all the same, tried to keep a work going to be a light for the Lord in that kind of place. So this was divine appreciation for the efforts they were making. And Christ's words to a struggling assembly, besides expressing deep divine appreciation, also tell of divine defense in verse 9, because sooner or later, the Lord will oblige those who have either opposed such a work as that of this faithful assembly, or who have at least slandered it. He'll oblige them to admit that what they stood for was the truth, and he'll do so in a way that humiliates those who have opposed it, those who have tried perhaps to shut the open door, but who couldn't because God had opened it. God referred in this passage to the synagogue of Satan, which probably meant Judaizers who often opposed the pure gospel and who insisted on everybody's keeping the law of Moses, even to earn salvation with. They were the kind of Jews that the Lord refers to in Romans chapter 2, verse 28, who said, "For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart." The Jews who didn't recognize Christ as their Messiah, they were the first people group to persecute Christians. In fact, it was they who martyred Stephen, who was the first Christian martyr. And when the Roman emperors began to demand that the emperor be worshipped, they tended to give an exemption from that to Jews, to exempt them from emperor worship, because they knew the Jews wouldn't approve. And the Romans had a tendency to revere and venerate anything that was ancient. And Judaism was ancient, so they tend to revere it, and they didn't persecute the Jews. But Christianity was not considered ancient. Some Jews or some Christians were accepted by Jewish synagogues, but any who were not could be prosecuted by the Romans for not worshiping their emperor, and therefore Christians were persecuted that way. But here, God is saying to them, those who falsely claim to be Jews, but it's false because they haven't recognized their Messiah, I'm going to oblige them someday to admit that what you have been teaching and what you've been standing for is the truth. They'll be obliged to recognize it, and they'll be obliged to come and worship at your feet. That's how the King James Version has it, and maybe some have been shocked by it, but the word translated worship there can simply mean to show great respect or to do homage. So it might have meant nothing more than simply that those who had opposed the work at Philadelphia would come and admit and show respect to them for having held to the truth. or it might mean that they would bow down and worship God, but in front of the people of Philadelphia. So there is the divine defense then for a small and struggling assembly. And Christ's door of opportunity and service encourages a struggling assembly. Besides showing it divine appreciation and divine defense, it would encourage it by showing it divine support in verse 10, because Christ promised to those who keep Christ's command to endure and who will persevere in the truth at any cost. He said, I will keep you then. You have kept serving me faithfully. You have kept my word, kept my command. So I will keep you when a severe trial that is coming comes. You might be tempted in that day to renounce the truth or to quit serving, but I'll keep you so you won't renounce the truth or quit serving. Now, when exactly is that hour of trial or hour of temptation that's referred to? Some will tell us that it's the Great Tribulation, which is still future, but I would maintain that that can't be. For one thing, I reject the theory that sees each of the churches of Asia as representing one period of time in the church age. So they represent 7 different stages. And my great reason for that is that if there were 7 ages that must pass before Christ's return, then at any time before the last one, the rapture would not have been imminent. Like, for example, in the period that people who hold that theory would say is the age of Sardis, which they say the time of the Reformation was. At that time, people couldn't have said the rapture is imminent because there was still 3 more ages to come before the rapture could take place. And I insist very strongly that the rapture has been imminent ever since Pentecost. So therefore, any theory that would make the rapture less than imminent at any time must be rejected. At any rate, those who hold that theory, that see the 7 churches as representations of 7 ages, they're inconsistent if they say that this hour of trial to come is the Great Tribulation, because the Great Tribulation will be after the church age is over. When Christ comes to take us home, that'll be the end of the church age. And yet, in the age that they say was the Philadelphian age, well, that was the second last age. So it would be inconsistent to tell such people that God will keep them at the hour of the Great Tribulation, because there would be 1 more age to come before then, and they would be gone by that hour of trial. And the precise meaning of that preposition translated from in this verse is debated a lot. Many who believe in pre-tribulation rapture, which I do for that matter, they say that it means from, but those who believe in post-tribulation rapture say that the word means in or during. But some very reliable commentators say that actually the word is richer than that, and it means in, but then removed out of. So I don't think the reference here is to the rapture at all, nor that the hour of trial is the Great Tribulation. Rather, there are different words for world in the New Testament. The word cosmos means the world system, the system that's controlled by Satan, the prince of this world. Then there's the word aeon, that means age, such as that Christ saves us from this present evil world, or literally age. But the word that is used here for word is oikumene, from which we get our word ecumenical. But the word means inhabited land. And in the New Testament, that word is consistently applied to the Roman Empire. So therefore, this hour of trial is one that is to come on all the lands occupied by the Roman Empire. And I think that it's a promise to the literal church in Philadelphia of a trial that would come on them before the end of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire most certainly did persecute Christians. But God promised you to protect the assembly in Philadelphia from that trial, which would mean all the persecutions before Constantine's time, because after Constantine, there was no more persecution of Christians by the Roman Empire. Now, nothing is said about this assembly as having already suffered either political or any kind of violent persecution, but Christ promises that because it has been faithful to his word, therefore he'll keep it during that time of persecution, showing that living for Christ prepares us to die for him if he calls on us for that. Have you ever wondered, would I be prepared to die for Christ if he called me to it? The answer is, if you want to be prepared to die for Christ, then live for him now. If we live for Christ now, he'll give us the grace to die for him if he so calls us. But don't expect God to give you the grace to die for Christ if you haven't been living for him until then. So keeping this assembly during that time of trial that was to come on them, that was divine support. So Christ's door of opportunity then, that he is promising to this small and struggling assembly, this door presents it with divine appreciation, divine defense, divine support, and it encourages it by giving it a divine exhortation in verse 11, where Christ says, I am coming quickly, or I am coming suddenly, or at a great speed. That's the literal meaning here. The meaning of I'm coming quickly is not that Christ will come soon, although we're certainly inclined to believe that he will come soon. And those who are weary of the present world tend to wish that this expression meant I'm coming soon. But the meaning in the text here and in the word for quickly, it means when I come, it'll be suddenly, and it'll be totally unexpected to anybody. There will be nothing that apparently leads up to it, so it'll take everybody completely by surprise. I'm coming suddenly. So the purpose of this statement is not to assure us that it won't be long, but rather it's to exhort us to be ready at any time, as Christ exhorted us in Matthew 24:44, when he said, you also be ready, because at a time that you don't expect, the Son of Man will come. So he's going to come. When he does come, it'll be sudden. It'll have nothing visible that'll lead up to it. And it'll take everybody totally by surprise. And he exhorts the assembly then, because I might come at any moment, it'll take everybody entirely by surprise. Therefore, hold fast or hold firmly. That is, continue faithfully as you are, as you have been doing. Now, let's not take this exhortation to automatically mean just continue on doing as you have been doing. That could give us a dangerous type of comfort, telling us, well, just continue on. And there are many who are doing exactly that. Many misunderstand the exhortation, occupy till I come, and they think that just to meet week after week, the same small, cozy number without doing anything about outreach, well, they're occupying till Christ comes. In fact, they're doing the very opposite of what he meant when he said, occupy till I come, because that's in the parable of the talents. And what the master evidently expected of his servants was that they keep busy till he come and look for an increase. But holding firm requires several things, or holding fast. And one of them is self-examination. Let us examine whether is it possible that part of the struggle that we're going through, if we're a small and struggling group, could it be that part of the struggle could have legitimately been avoided? By all means, let us keep pure, even if it causes hurt. But has there been any needless hurt or offense among us. And I am thinking of one assembly where I ministered frequently over a period of about 20 years. And all through those 20 years, I heard from people in the assembly, there's a tendency for newcomers who come to the assembly to be hurt. And now if that had come from only one person, I'd have thought, well, maybe he's where the trouble is. But when I heard it from different people over all that period, I thought, there must be something wrong here that I haven't seen. And I still don't know what it could have been that caused the hurt, but from how often I heard of it, I thought there's something wrong, and if only the Lord would open the eyes of whoever is the cause of that hurt. And by all means, let us sacrifice numbers if we must for the sake of faithfulness, but have we suffered any needless losses? That's a cause for self-examination. Might we have allowed zeal to avoid one kind of evil to push us so far in the opposite direction as to cause another evil? And here's an example I can give. I agree 100% that we must not try to win people to an apparent profession of salvation by entertainment, or to get them out by entertainment. I agree 100% with that, but I also maintain just as firmly that we must be careful about what we label as entertainment. Are we labeling as entertainment something that really is quite legitimate? Here's an example of that. Some Christians in an assembly that I know, they suggested that their assembly have a barbecued supper on the chapel property, and that they invite people from the community to come to that barbecued supper, and that then after the supper, they have the brothers in the assembly give their testimonies, telling how the Lord had brought them to himself. And the leaders of the assembly, the oversight said, oh no, you can't do that. A barbecued supper, that's entertainment. And yet the people who told me about the suggestion they had made, they said, we're absolutely certain that those men in the oversight, they'd have had no objection at all to inviting a person to supper in your house and giving him the gospel there. And I ask, what's the difference? In one case or another, it's inviting people to a meal and presenting them the gospel. Unless one thinks that it's more spiritual to cook and eat a meal indoors than outdoors. Well, that doesn't go over too well, does it? Especially when we consider that Christ fed multitudes outdoors, and that in the biblical world, cooking was usually done outdoors if the weather permitted it, because the houses they had in the biblical world didn't have chimneys, so if they cooked indoors, the only place the smoke could get out was through the windows, and in the meantime, it smoked up the house. So they'd only cook indoors when the weather made it necessary. So I think that was a rather strained claim to say that having a barbecued supper on the chapel property would be entertainment. I think the people who made that suggestion had a very good reason for it, because people today tend to be afraid to go inside a building that is used for, quote, religious purposes. And they were made that way by that episode back in 1979. Remember that preacher by the name of Jim Jones, who started out as a mainline Pentecostal preacher, but then he went off the track in his doctrine more and more until he claimed to be God. And then one day at an evening meeting, and there were over 900 people in that church. And at one evening meeting, they closed the doors, and then men handed out guns to the people and ordered them to shoot themselves. And they had armed guards at all the doors to shoot anybody who tried to escape. And since that episode, well, I think that changed the world once for all. People have been afraid to go inside a building for, quote, religious purposes, unless their confidence has been fully won. So today, instead of trying to reach out by expecting the people to come in and hear the gospel, today we need to go out to the people with the gospel. Then, besides some self-examination, we need for our trust to be intensified, our trust in God. Shortly before the revival in the Hebrides, that began in 1949, a certain servant of God expressed frustration over the steady decline in his local church and of the indifference of most believers. And there were two ladies, one of them blind and the other really crippled with arthritis, but who were praying together regularly for a revival. One of those two ladies heard him express his frustration over the steady decline in the local church, and they heard that brother say, "I've tried everything I can think of, and nothing is working." And one of those two ladies asked him, "Have you tried God?" And by that she meant, "Have you tried spending many extra hours in prayer, not just the regular prayer times?" And so the brother took her advice, and that was a factor in leading to that revival. And furthermore, this exhortation that accompanies Christ's words about the open door of opportunity is that it calls for everybody's cooperation. Is everybody in the assembly involved in its ministry to the extent that he's able to? Does everybody who could possibly come to prayer meeting come? And does everybody truly believe that that's where the assembly gets its power, its spiritual power, from prayer? And sisters, a special exhortation to you, beware of thinking, it doesn't matter if I come to a prayer meeting or not because I can't pray anyway. That's an erroneous notion, because you can pray, yes, silently, but just as really, because when a brother is leading in prayer, everybody present is supposed to be following his prayer and praying that same prayer in his or her heart. So by joining those brothers who pray out loud, you are praying, and your prayers can help the assembly obtain divine power. And are we prepared to make genuine sacrifices to keep our assembly functioning? An elder of a small and struggling assembly who I once knew, he's now with the Lord, but he told me of how very often he hears of conferences elsewhere that he would love to attend, but he told me he would never attend anything that would absent him from his home assembly on the Lord's Day, because he said, when your assembly is small, you've got to be there. Now, certainly to attend conferences is legitimate. It gives refreshment to us. And if our home assembly is thriving, then it won't hurt if we're at a conference that includes the Lord's Day and we stay over for the Lord's Day. But this elder was telling me, because my home assembly is so small and struggling, I'll never miss being there on the Lord's Day, because just my absence would make such a noticeable difference. And when he told me that, I thought, would to God that there were more Christians who think that way and who are willing to make genuine sacrifices, even if something normally legitimate, in order to help their assembly make legitimate gains. So is it legitimate to go on holidays then? Well, of course it is. Christ even said, come yourselves apart and rest a while. But if our assembly is small and struggling, then how about taking our holidays at a place that's not too far away? Maybe not more than half a day's drive. Certainly we can find some place that's suitable, and then be able to get back before the following Lord's Day. And in fact, if we feel a need of 2 weeks holiday, if it's at a place that's not too far away, why not come home for the Lord's Day and then return to that same place afterwards? But how many are willing to even make that amount of sacrifice? In the studies that I've done about revival in the past few years, I've learned that we can't make a revival happen, and revivals do not conform to one set pattern. And yet there's one thing that's always noticeable. A revival is always preceded by there being Christians who care enough to make real sacrifices in order to pray. And even if some people in the assembly just won't cooperate, well, let those who care persevere in all the ways that we've shown. Christ's door of opportunity that he is presenting to a small struggling assembly shows that divine appreciation, divine defense, divine support, divine exhortation, and finally a divine welcome in verses 12 and 13, where he says, to those who overcome in the struggle, particularly in maintaining an assembly's testimony as a lampstand in its place, he promises them, that he makes a wonderful promise to them. He says he'll make them as pillars in his house. That is, saints are part of a spiritual building that's not visible to the eye of the body, but that is very real to God. And he says those pillars will not go out of the building anymore. This is probably an allusion to the frequent earthquakes in Philadelphia that could destroy a building, so the pillars would fall and be removed. But he's saying in this spiritual building, there won't be any spiritual earthquakes that would destroy this building. It'll last forever. A very strong assurance of the eternal security of the believer. Those who show that they are true believers by overcoming, because whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And he says, I'll write my name on them, that is the pillars that they are. It was customary in New Testament times that the names of people who had done notable deeds in the community, and also the names of some who had been involved in the construction of the building, their names would be written on the pillars of the building. And so Christ is saying, I'm going to write my name on the saints who are pillars in this spiritual building. Not to say that the believers are these things that the name indicates, but that they are owned by the one who bears this name. And what name is it that Christ calls his new name that he's going to write on the saints who are pillars in his spiritual building? It's probably the threefold name that we read in chapter 19 of Revelation, where we read of Christ coming, riding on a white horse, and he is, in verse 11, he's called faithful and true. In verse 13, he's called the Word of God. And in verse 16, he's called King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And his writing his name on us will show that we are owned by the one who is faithful and true, and the Word of God, and King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So all this imagery amounts to saying that the one who overcomes will receive a royal welcome into heaven, into God's eternal house, because he served God faithfully in God's temporary earthly house, the spiritual temple during his earthly life. Faithful Christian service does not guarantee an outward appearance of success, whether in numbers or in any other kind of impression made. We have to face satanic opposition in this world and expect a battle. And the degree of difficulty in different kinds of service is not equal for everybody. So we must not compare ourselves with others or compare our service with that of others, but rather be faithful in what God has called us to, and remember also that God's attention is primarily on our faithfulness. And for these reasons, Christ encourages those who labor in a small and struggling work by opening to them a special door of opportunity. And he encourages them by showing divine appreciation, divine defense, divine support, by giving us a divine exhortation, and by extending to us a divine welcome. So let's take God's intended encouragement then from this door of opportunity and persevere so that we can overcome by maintaining a testimony wherever he has placed us, and by keeping our lamp shining brightly until Christ comes. Our blessed Lord God, thou art gracious to us in seeking to encourage us. we do find that the battle is fierce on earth. The struggle is hard to maintain our testimony in the area where thou hast placed us. But we have these promises that give us assurance that if we labor faithfully for thee, it'll have eternal value, and thou wilt give us fruit in due time. But in the meantime, may we be concerned with faithfulness to the truth, faithfulness to the work that thou hast called us to. For I prayed in our